Let's see, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Oh, perfect, perfect. Well, welcome everyone to the webinar. We are so excited today to talk about, well, I shouldn't necessarily say we're excited to talk about flooding, but it's important to talk about flooding and some of the options that are available to you, such as flood insurance. We have two great speakers joining us tonight, Ceil Strauss, who is our state floodplain manager here in Minnesota, and James Fink, who is a regional flood insurance liaison with FEMA. This webinar came as a result of some collaborative work between the Park Point Erosion and High Water Committee and Minnesota's Lake Superior Coastal Program and the DNR. And I want to thank you so much for coming tonight. Before we hear from our speakers, just a reminder that we are going to be holding questions until after both presentations. In order to post your question at the bottom of your page, there's a chat box. Please go ahead and submit those as soon as they come up, and we'll be watching those as they speak. We have just a quick poll that Madison is going to bring up that gives us a little bit of information about why you're here tonight. So Madison, if you want to go ahead and launch that, and if you're not able to see that, if you're in a browser mode, please go ahead and just respond in the chat. Have you experienced flooding or other damages where you are? Now, maybe it was direct impacts from waves, maybe you've experienced erosion, flooding in your home or around your property, water in your basement, or maybe you're one of the lucky ones and you haven't had any of these problems yet, but you just want to know more about how to protect yourself. If you can tell us a little bit about why you're here tonight, go ahead and take that quick poll as Madison brings that up. Or if you're not able to see that, you can just put your response right in the chat box.
It looks like we've had a nice mix of responses, so thank you all for submitting your responses. It was a bit of a toss-up. We're seeing some 50% of us have seen some direct impact from waves, 60% erosion, a smaller number of flooding in their home, 20%, some flooding around your property and water in the basement, and 27% of us, Melanie, have been lucky so far. So a wide range of impacts for flooding that we've been seeing with our attendees tonight.
I'm jealous of the ones who've been lucky so far. I haven't. So to start us off tonight, our first speaker this evening is Ceil Strauss. Ceil is the Minnesota State Floodplain Manager. She works in the Department of Natural Resources. Today, she's going to speak to us about flooding that occurs on Minnesota Point and how we can understand our flood risks. So Ceil, you're welcome to go ahead and take over and share your screen.
Okay, can you hear me and see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Great. Well, I'm going to start off talking a little bit about who the players are here and where things fit in. Then a little bit more about different kinds of risks and the types of risks that FEMA maps. Then I know a lot of people are interested in what's happening with the map update, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then we'll see what other questions come up after both James and I are done talking, I believe. And get my cursor on the right screen. Darn. Huh. I've got too many screens here. Will this work? Yep, there it goes. Okay. So this is the flooding or floodplain management is a national program. It was started just over 50 years ago in 1968, and the original goals of Congress were this program would help to identify floodplain areas, the higher hazard areas, and those are the FEMA maps. We've got standards that are regulating the kind of development you do in floodplains in those identified high-risk areas. And flood insurance was made available back in '68, but didn't become mandatory until '73. And then a little bit more recently, more of the mitigation programs, grants to help reduce risk have been added. But in Minnesota, we did adopt our enabling statute, our enabling law in 1969. So we just celebrated our 50th anniversary for that last year. And our rules have been in effect since 1970. So the program has been around for a while. Within Minnesota, we do have all of our counties that do zoning, and a good number of our cities are enrolled in the program, participate in the program. We have a few townships that also do zoning that are in the program, and the tribal communities enroll separately if they choose to. So one of the points that I make here, though, is that over 96% of the population of Minnesota lives in a community that participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. Oh, I guess I had that coming in. And the way that it works is that the community, whoever the zoning authority is, they adopt regulations, and they're the ones that enforce those regulations. They have to get into the National Flood Insurance Program to begin with, and they administer their regulations, and they keep records. The state has oversight and guidance responsibilities. We work with FEMA, we coordinate with FEMA on a lot of things. And the watershed districts, not so critical in that part of the state, but in some parts of the state, they're a very big player. And then FEMA, they oversee the National Flood Insurance Program. They have the funding for a lot of the mapping and work that we do, and they are involved in communities getting enrolled in those kinds of things. But the most important is the local community. So in the community, they do, when they get in the program, they agree to have an ordinance and enforce that ordinance and keep records. And because they're in the National Flood Insurance Program, anyone in their community can buy flood insurance. And James will get into the details more, but basically, if you're in the high-risk zones and you have a federally backed loan, you may be required to get flood insurance. But if you're outside those higher risk zones, you can still get flood insurance, and it's actually a cheaper price. And then there's some other kinds of assistance and grants that become available to those communities. So the maps, will be looking at a couple different versions of map things, but we talk about the high risk zones, which on the older maps, like you have in Duluth, they're a darker gray shaded area. The medium risk, which is in your area, it's going to be mainly the 500-year type floodplain, the 0.2% floodplain. That's going to be a lighter gray. And then the other areas that are not shaded are considered the lower risk areas. The mapping for this program, when they do the mapping, if they do a detailed map, they'll figure out the 10, the 50, the 100-year, and the 500-year flood elevations. But on the map, they will map the 100-year and the 500-year. And that 100-year, that 1% annual chance flood is what's used for regulatory purposes and for determining if flood insurance is mandatory or if you're in a high risk zone for the flood insurance rates. Some synonymous terms that I've already used, but we tend to be bad about using acronyms, so I want to get them up front here. That 1% annual chance flood is what people will often call the 100-year flood, but you got a 1% chance of that size flood or larger happening every year. We like to stay away from the 100-year flood because people tend to think that if they had their flood this year, they're good for another 99 years, and that's not the way the flooding works. When we're looking at some of the FEMA terminology, they refer to that 100-year flood as that base flood elevation, or BFE. In Minnesota law, you won't see some of those terms. You'll actually see them call it the regional flood. And when you're talking to an insurance agent, they often will call it the special flood hazard area. And I tend to call that area, the high flood risk area. So the maps are not perfect, and they're getting better as we go forward, but in this picture here, it's showing that pinkish area is showing the boundary of the official FEMA map in that area, but now we have better elevation data. So if you look in that area to the left of the pinkish area, you can see an area that, based on elevation contours, you can see it's a low area, but it's not included in the area that FEMA is including. So the flood maps don't necessarily include all those low areas, all the areas that should be considered part of that 1% annual chance flood. So if you're looking at a higher site, they might be told they're in the floodplain because the boundaries aren't the greatest on the maps. But on the other side, you might have someone who's building in an area that really is low. And in Minnesota law, the community is required that they apply the regulations when they know that they're in that low area like that. So what kinds of risks are shown on the maps? On the FEMA maps currently, as I mentioned, it shows that 1% and the 0.2% annual chance floods, or the 100-year and 500-year floodplain. And those figures, those drawings for the Duluth area the maps came out in 1980. So the data that's based on is from the 70s and earlier. So this is the historical flood risk. And now as we go into future maps, they will be updating that data that they used, and they'll be using the most up-to-date data that they've got. And those of you who know more about these kind of details, a lot of the modeling that uses the 24-hour 100-year flood, in those models before, they were using data from 1960, and now they're using data from 2013 that's referred to as the Atlas 14 data. So it's another 50 years of data and a broader network of data. The other thing on the future maps is that even some of our A-zone, our areas where it was more approximate studies, we will still have other magnitudes of flooding. We'll have that 10%, 4%, 2%, which are the 10-year, 25-year, 50-year floods, in addition to our 100-year and 500-year data. And that's really helpful for other kinds of planning. For instance, the 10-year we use a lot for on-site septic systems or storm sewer designs and those kinds of things. The new maps will also have coastal flooding risks on them, and they will be a digital product, so you can overlay other information you've got. But some of the other risks that aren't on the maps would be things like groundwater or high water tables. The FEMA maps are looking at surface water flooding. And in recent years, a lot of us have had high water tables. We've got landlocked lakes all over the state that it's way above what the levels have been in the past, partly because we've had a really wet several years here, and you've got increased development, and you've got changing weather patterns and all those things. So the groundwater, high water tables are definitely a different kind of flooding risk. And again, the FEMA maps are mapping the surface water kinds of flooding. Another type of risk we see next to the lakes and in other steep areas along streams are landslides and those steep slopes that get super saturated so if it already got wet conditions and we get a big rain, we see a lot of landslides, way more in recent years than we've seen in the past in Minnesota. Pluvial flooding, which is a fancy way of saying urban flooding, or the flooding that's not associated with the rivers there. Urban flooding continues to be an issue in many areas, and especially where you don't have adequate stormwater drainage or where things have just been developing faster. You're getting more impervious surface. A lot of that urban flooding area is not on the FEMA maps. And then there's just other unmapped areas that when these maps were done in the 80s, most of the maps were done in the 80s, and they were making the decisions on where to map. There were areas where they said, well, nobody's going to live here. You know, we got plenty of room to expand in the city. We don't need to spend money mapping those other areas because we don't think anybody's going to be living there, at least in the near future. Well, now those maps are getting pretty darn old, 40-year-old maps, and people are moving into some of those areas. So that's another challenge we have with a lot of our maps. Plus, we've got climate change. It's getting warmer and wetter. And the warmth is especially the lows in the winters are getting higher. And that's a whole separate presentation that's fascinating if you ever get a chance to listen to our state climatologists. They've got some really nice presentations. But for talking about flooding here, we are definitely seeing more of the big rains. Sometimes they're calling them the mega rains, where they're over 6 inches over 1,000 square mile area. And since 2000, those have been 4 times more common than in the previous 3 decades. And we're also seeing a big increase in the number of 3-inch rains. So we're seeing a slight increase in the overall precipitation, but we're definitely seeing more of those bigger storms. And the FEMA maps aren't taking those kinds of patterns into account. I mentioned we're going through some updates in the maps. The maps that are currently in the Duluth area are what we call the yesterday maps. And we are transitioning, and the ones as we're going forward are digital. We can do depth maps and show the relative depth of flooding in areas, and there's a lot of other things that we can use those depths for seeing which roads are going to be closed down first, or where should the emergency evacuation routes be, and some of those kinds of things. But unfortunately, some of our first digital maps, they just took the old shape of the floodplain and plopped them into a digital format, and they don't match the reality on the ground. But the good news is going forward, we do have the better elevation data. It's referred to as LiDAR. And basically, you've got planes that went and shot down light, and they timed how fast it came back, and they get good elevation information. And as we update the maps, we will be using that better data. So the new maps have a little bit different look too. They have a nice aerial photo background. They are digital products, so you can put them on top of other layers and use them in your computer mapping systems, like GIS systems, and do some really cool stuff to evaluate the risks. So that's what we're going to have in the future. But here's what we've got now in the Duluth area. This is basically a 1980 map that they say is 1992 because on this flood insurance rate map, they added some COBRA zones, some coastal barrier areas there. But basically, you can see there's no aerial photo background. It's hard to see where you are. There's not many streets. And it's just the dark shading versus the unshaded areas. So it's not the easiest to interpret. And then Duluth's maps came out at a time when they were putting our detailed study information, the cross sections that we use to get the more detailed information on our maps, were actually on a separate map. And if you look in the upper left part of this slide, you'll see some of the streams, you'll see where the cross sections are, and it's a challenge to go back and forth using the different maps here. And then those tied to something called a flood insurance study, and that's where you can see where, you know, cross section H and I and all those cross sections where their data is. For the lake area, for Lake Superior, there is a flood insurance study on the page where it talks about the elevations of the lakes. The only lake listed in Duluth, of course, is Lake Superior. They did the mapping based on what they call the still water elevations, so not taking into account any of the waves or the wave action. But they actually did, in this old study, talk about wave run-up elevations. And they show that because of the wave impacts, that the impacts do go higher in some areas along the shoreline. And it's hard to read in here. I tried to put a couple of the main points there that are there in that tiny writing there, but you can look at page 21 of the Duluth flood insurance study yourself if you're interested. Some better ways to view it. Here's the city of Duluth's viewer, and when you can turn on those layers and just see the floodplain, it makes it a lot easier. And thankfully, lots of our cities and the county have some nice viewers like this. Or the DNR, we've got something called MnTopo. In fact, if you just search MnTopo, you can turn on aerial background and the 2-foot contours and the flood boundaries. So there are some tools to try and make it a little easier, but they're still old maps. With the updates, we do have updates coming here in St. Louis County. One thing to note in this slide is there's a bunch of pink lines there, and what that's showing is where modeling has been done on more streams in the county, getting some data that's not on the official FEMA maps, but it's available for making better decisions on where to build and whether you're in the high-risk areas or not. So I mentioned those pink lines are representing where there's models available and we've got better data. Because of the default color that we use for those lines, for those cross sections, is the bright pink. We tend to call it the pink lines. There's also been a lot of work going on with the Duluth city staff has been providing a lot of data to FEMA's contractors, and FEMA's contractors have been doing a lot of work both on the coastal maps and throughout the county on getting things updated. But it is a big county and it is a lot of work. And it was delayed for getting St. Louis County done for a while because it is such a big county. And when you think about it, it's bigger than several states just on its own, the county is. The coast draft maps for showing the coastal risk here, there was, oh, I put the wrong date there. That's should have been 2018. I mistyped, I'm sorry. But heck, it's already been a couple years since we were out showing those maps and sharing those with local officials. And there are some PDFs of those maps around, and there should be paper copies in a couple of the offices. They had a really nice viewer, but that got broken several months ago. And in spite of me whining and bringing up that we'd really like that back, it hasn't happened yet. And I wouldn't hold my breath, but hopefully we'll get a viewer again soon and be able to see some of the good work that they had done in showing the coastal, where the wave run-ups are, what the transects are in that area, and what the risk is along Lake Superior. Here's a couple of the transects that were part of the product that the FEMA contractors shared with us. So I was showing a couple different kinds of land areas, and it really depends on how flat the area is, if the wave's going up against a steep area, and those of you who live in that area, you know how the waves come in and hit different landforms differently. And some places they hit them and the spray goes 20 feet up in the air, and others it just kind of goes over the land more easily. And so that was what they were trying to look at, the land types, and they had these transects where they calculated what kind of impacts from the waves they expect. So again, more information on that will be available in a more user-friendly format in the future, and there is some of the information around. So the map process now we are working on, or the FEMA contractors are working on the updated maps. There will be a what they call a flood risk review meeting to look at the draft maps. They keep pushing it back, but as of today, they're expecting that meeting to be in January. They thought it was going to be in December, but it's going to be after the holidays. So local officials will be invited to meetings to view those draft maps. And at that time, FEMA does make a really nice interactive viewer available. And if you wanted to see examples in other counties, you can go into mndnr.gov/county FP data, I think it is. But once those maps come out, then FEMA will take comments from that local official meeting. They'll go back and do more work. And a little over a year later is when they expect the official preliminary new maps to be coming out. Once those maps come out, there will be a formal local official meeting and a formal open house that all citizens, anyone who's interested would be invited to. After they have that, they have a formal 90-day appeal period. They address any appeals that come up during that period. And then once they've gone through that whole process, then they send letters to the communities and say, hey, we've been through all this process. We've got our best data that we know of for this area. And these maps are going to become effective in 6 months. So you'll see that I show that once the preliminary new maps come out, it's still about another 1.5 years because you got that 90-day appeal, you got that 6-month waiting period, and you've got some other back and forth. So we're still a ways away, but if you see issues with the maps, the earlier that we're aware of them, the better. Oh, this is the viewer I mentioned, that once the preliminary new maps or once those draft work maps are out, we'll have a link from this page on our DNR website, and to make it a little easier for you to find that interactive viewer. And just a couple quick slides talking about the regulations. And in case you're having trouble reading that, it says building in a floodplain is like pitching your tent on a highway when there are no cars coming. We know exactly where that road is. That's where the cars are going to come down. We're doing the best job we can to map the high risk areas. And if you're in those high flood risk areas, there's going to be requirements for what you can do in terms of building. We break it into flood fringe, floodway. The floodway is basically where you've got the faster moving water, and we basically don't allow buildings in those areas. In the flood fringe area, you're going to get wet, so we're going to require that you build in a safer way, that you build so that your lowest floor is above those flood elevations with a safety factor in there. So I'm not going to go into any more details on that. I think that's my 20 minutes or maybe a little bit more. Let me get past this. Oh, the other thing is when we do have the coastal zone requirements, when we do have some of those areas that are shown on the maps with the coastal zone, the buildings will have to be elevated on stilts or pilings because the lowest support has to be above the flood elevation, and you can't do filling. So it'll be definitely a different kind of construction, but you've seen pictures or probably seen it in person if you've been to coastal areas. There we go. So I should probably stop presenting and let James share.
Thank you so much, Ceil. Yes, we're going to hold our questions until after James speaks, but please, if you have any questions, type them into the chat box. Thank you so much, Ceil, for that really good overview. Our second speaker this evening is James Sink. James is our regional liaison for the National Flood Insurance Program, which Ceil just kind of gave you a little bit of an introduction to. And he's going to talk to us about what flood insurance is and how it can help protect you, whether you're a resident or a business, from flooding and high water issues. So go ahead, and James.
Everyone, my name, as you said, is James Sink. I am the FEMA Region 5 Flood Insurance Liaison. I just want to make sure that everyone is seeing the presentation. Is that correct?
Yes, it looks good.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so Ceil, thank you so much for talking about so many important topics, including the flood maps, the various zones, the COBRA area. Those are all things I'm going to touch on. So yeah, lots of things going on. So Ceil already explained what the National Flood Insurance Program is. Of course, it's a voluntary program. We want to reduce losses to life and property in areas from flooding. Flooding is, of course, the most common and costly natural disaster in the United States. When it comes to insurance, flood is the third the number 3 event for which people are underinsured. So the number 1 being earthquake. So most people who should have earthquake insurance do not. The second being wind. Most people who should have wind insurance do not. And number 3 is flood. We used to say that 20% of flood insurance claims came from low to moderate risk areas. That is changing, as Ceil alluded to. We're now finding that over the last 4 years specifically, over 40% of our flood insurance claims have come from areas that are considered low to moderate risk. In Minnesota, historically, over 50% of claims come from areas that are considered low to moderate risk. So even if you're not in that mapped high risk area, it's so important that people have flood insurance. And we're going to talk more about that and how premiums are set. So one of the questions is who can sell flood insurance? And it's going to be any state licensed insurance agent, carrier, or broker who is in good standing with their state regulator, who is licensed to write property and casualty policies, and that have completed certain mandatory trainings as required by their state Department of Insurance. A source of confusion for some people is the NFIP Direct program and the Write Your Own program. What that is I'd always describe it as 2 sides of the same coin. If you have an NFIP Direct policy, what that means is that an individual insurance agent has contracted directly with FEMA to sell flood insurance. In that case, FEMA itself is the insurance company. So we would handle the claims, we would accept the payment for the premium and all that kind of stuff, just as any other insurance company would. The Write Your Own program is when a insurance company contracts with the National Flood Insurance Program and FEMA to sell flood insurance policies under their own name. In that case, they're underwritten by FEMA. They follow the same rules as the NFIP Direct program. It doesn't matter if you have flood insurance through NFIP Direct or a Write Your Own company. The premium is going to be the same. The policy benefits are going to be the same. The underwriting rules are going to be the same. They're all part of the National Flood Insurance Program. There are about 60 companies that currently contract with FEMA to write flood insurance policies under their own name that we underwrite. So if you have insurance now, likely it is with a company that writes flood insurance through the NFIP. Ceil talked about this earlier. Anyone in a participating community can purchase flood insurance. Something that the number 1 complaint that I get from members of the public is that their insurance agent told them that they couldn't buy flood insurance because they were not in a high risk area. This is my home neighborhood in Moorhead, Minnesota, and you can see here a modern flood insurance map. So what people often hear is that their insurance agent says, well, you're not in this blue high risk zone here or this red hashed area here, so you can't have flood insurance. That's not true. If you are in a community that participates, you can buy flood insurance. It doesn't matter what flood zone you're in. It doesn't matter what color zone your house is in. You can buy flood insurance. So this red hashed area and the blue area, that is the special flood hazard area or the high risk area. This orange area is an area of moderate risk. And then this area where there's no coloring, that is called it's a non-special flood hazard area. It's an area of lower risk. So yes, it's important to know anyone in a participating community can buy flood insurance. You do not have to live in a floodplain. That is the number 1 misunderstanding that I get called about. There are exceptions to this, and this is an important exception for this community, and that is the Coastal Barrier Resources Act. There is what we call a COBRA zone, Coastal Barrier Resources Act, a COBRA zone to the southern end of the sandbar. So in that area, you'll see it's designated on the map in pink with Minnesota 01. Flood insurance by and large is not available in that area. The Coastal Barrier Resources Act is intended to reduce the loss of human life and expenditure of taxpayer money and damages to wildlife. So in certain areas that have been designated by Congress under the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, it kind of works like a wildlife refuge. There's a lot of restrictions on what can be done with federal funding in that area. So in this case, by and large, flood insurance would not be available. There might be exceptions. So if you live in or around that COBRA zone, talk to your insurance agent so they can look at your specific situation. We might be able to make it work, but generally speaking, flood insurance would not be available if you are in that pink zone highlighted on the map there. There's also a waiting period for flood insurance. There is usually a 30-day waiting period. After you pay your premium, your flood insurance policy will come into force 30 days later. There are exceptions, so there is no waiting period if you are purchasing flood insurance because you have a mortgage that requires flood insurance. There are also exceptions for areas affected by wildfire. Those are rare in this area, but it could always happen if that's something that comes up. Katrina Covino, who is one of the participants in today's session, she's a contractor that I work with, and myself will deal with that, and we will notify the affected areas that they are in an area where there is an exception because of wildfire. But again, pretty rare in this region. This is more common out west, but if it did happen in northern Minnesota, that is definitely something Katrina and I would take care of. There is also a one-day waiting period for flood insurance policies purchased within 12 months of a map change. So in anticipation of a future map change for this area, if you purchased flood insurance within 12 months of that new flood insurance map being effective, there would only be a one-day waiting period, not a 30-day waiting period. There are other very important things to know about related to that map change, including things like grandfathering, which allows you to lock in your existing flood insurance premium if you are continuously insured. Other things called a newly mapped procedure. I can talk more specifically about those if people have questions, but my advice would be when we have an open house for that map change, please attend. Katrina and I will have very important information that can help you save some money on your flood insurance when that time comes. So if you're not currently insured, consider it, talk to your insurance agent, see if it makes sense for you. And I would suggest not letting that lapse, be continuously covered, knowing that there is a map change in process. Ceil already talked about the flood insurance rate map, so I'm just gonna move on from here. If you are in the gray colored area, you would be in that special flood hazard area. What that would mean is if you have a federally backed mortgage, you are likely required to have flood insurance on that structure. If you are not in that grayed out area, you are in a moderate risk zone. In this case, it is a C as in Charlie zone or a B as in Bravo zone. That does not mean that you're required to have flood insurance. That's going to be a lender decision. So individual lender on a case-by-case situation may require flood insurance, but for the purposes of the Flood Protection Act, you are not required to have flood insurance. That would be up to the individual lender. I have a short video on how premiums are set. That's a really common question that I have, so I'm going to let that play so that we can learn a little bit more about flood insurance premiums.
You've worked hard and finally have everything in your home set up the way you want it. It's your sanctuary. And you want to take extra steps to protect it with flood insurance because you know floods are the most common and costly natural disaster in the United States. But what factors determine how much your flood insurance will? There are several factors that determine how much you'll pay for flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program. But rates do not differ from company to company or agent to agent. The amount you pay for your policy is calculated based on factors such as the year your home was built and whether it's compliant with local floodplain ordinances, if it's your primary residence, the elevation of your lowest floor, your deductible amount, the coverage amount for your structure and contents, and your flood risk. Remember, floods can happen at any time, and you don't have to live in a high-risk flood zone to be at risk of flooding. In fact, more than 20% of flood insurance claims come from properties outside the high-risk flood zone. Don't wait until you're hit by a flood to learn about flood insurance. Contact your insurance agent or visit floodsmart.gov to learn more about the factors that determine how much you pay for flood insurance.
So for those of you who are in that unshaded area, that C as in Charlie or B as in Bravo zone, you may be eligible for a preferred risk policy. Those are relatively inexpensive. They start at about $400 a year, and then they'll go up from there depending on your individual circumstance. If you choose higher or lower amount of insurance, of course, your premium may go up or down. So that would be a question that I can help you with if you want to talk to me about it, or you can talk to your insurance agent and we can look at your specific situation. When we're talking about coverages, there are 4 coverages available from the standard flood insurance policy through the National Flood Insurance Program. There's coverage A, which is for the building, coverage B, which is for personal property, coverage C, which is other coverages. That includes things like debris removal. If you need to sandbag, it would pay up to $1,000 for sandbagging, and the hourly labor of people that were helping with that, again, up to $1,000. Loss avoidance measures, that's like sandbagging. Then there's property moved to safety. That's if you have advanced notice of a flood and you want to move your stuff out of harm's way. Again, we would pay up to $1,000 for that. The condominium loss assessment is for people who live in a condo building as part of a condominium association. If your condo building floods and your condo building sends you a bill for that flood damage, if you have flood insurance on your individual unit, we will pay for that through the condominium loss assessment. So if you are on like the 30th floor of a condo building, I don't think there are any in this area, but as an example, might be a good idea to have flood insurance, because if that first floor floods and your condo association sends you a bill, we will cover it. Coverage D is increased cost of compliance. If your home or business is damaged to 50% or more of its fair market value by flooding, your flood insurance policy will pay up to $30,000 to help you build back better through either floodproofing, relocation, elevation, or demolition of the structure. The option that you can pick is decided by your local community, but you have that menu of 4 choices, and you and your local community will decide which one would be required. It is important to know that coverage A and coverage B are purchased separately. They are separate policy line items. There are separate premiums. So you can buy only building coverage, you can buy only contents coverage, or you can buy both. If you want both, make sure that both of those show up on your declaration page, because they do have separate premiums. Then we have another one of those short videos on what is covered by the flood insurance policy.
You know, flood insurance can help you recover from the financial consequences of flooding. But what do you need to know about flood insurance coverage? How do you know if you should purchase coverage for your structure, the contents of your home, or both? Like all insurance, flood insurance doesn't cover all items that could be damaged from a flood, so it's good to ask lots of questions. Coverage for your building is designed to pay for the necessary repair or replacement of flood-damaged structural components. For example, walls, floors, heating and cooling systems, large appliances, cabinets, and/or attached bookcases. The maximum building property coverage you can purchase is $250,000. Flood insurance contents coverage protects your personal property, such as clothing, furniture, small appliances, bedding, and other items in the home. The maximum contents coverage you can purchase is $100,000. To better understand how claims are paid, ask your agent to go over what is and what is not covered, and discuss how your insurer estimates the value of your property. For example, you will have limited building and personal contents coverage for your basement and for enclosures below some elevated buildings. This is an important topic to discuss with your insurer. For a complete list of what is covered and not covered by flood insurance policies, or for more information on the different types of policies available through the National Flood Insurance Program, visit floodsmart.gov or call your insurance agent today.
Okay, so that video was largely about the the dwelling form. That's the individual household form of flood insurance. We're going to talk more about this shortly. This slide here basically recaps what was on that slide, on that video, but I do want to draw your attention to the detached garage. You'll see that the video said detached garages are not covered, while this slide says that it is. Both are equally true. In order to have a detached garage covered, that is at the insured's option. So you have to choose for that to happen, and you have to tell your insurance agent that you want your detached garage covered, and it needs to show up on your declaration page. If you do not do that, and if it's not on your declaration page, then we will not pay for the detached garage. Also importantly, flood insurance does not cover temporary or additional living expenses. So in the event of a federal disaster declaration, it's important to register for disaster assistance. There are things that flood insurance does not cover that may be covered either by other forms of insurance, so talk with your insurance company, or by disaster assistance. So there are three policy forms. The first one, and what the focus of that video is the dwelling form. There again, $250,000 for the building, $100,000 for the contents, and $30,000 in increased cost of compliance. Remember that vacation and secondary homes are absolutely eligible for coverage under the National Flood Insurance Program. And also, you can have a contents only policy if you rent. General property or business policies are up to $500,000 for the building and $500,000 for contents, and again, $30,000 for ICC. The last one there is the Residential Condominium Building Association Policy, or RCBAP. That gets very complex very quickly, so if it applies to you, go ahead and ask, and I'll be happy to answer questions. But for sake, just to make it easy, coverage is about $250,000 times the number of units, and then $100,000 for contents owned in common. Again, the policy limits are fixed by statute, so we can't go above the policy limits you see here. We do know, home values have changed a lot, and the cost to repair has changed a lot, so this is something we're actively working on with Congress. But right now, these are what the policy limits are, and hopefully we'll have good news coming up about an increase in those policy limits. So now let's talk about what the definition of flood is. What you'll see on this slide is the definition from the standard flood insurance policy and also the definition found in regulation. Flooding is usually a general and temporary condition of partial or complete inundation of 2 or more acres of normally dry land, or 2 or more properties, one of which is your own property, from overflow of inland or tidal waters, unusual and rapid accumulation of runoff, or surface water from any source, or mud flow, or that last bullet point there about the collapse or subsidence of land along a shore of a lake. Make a long story short, in order to be eligible for a flood insurance claim, there has to be water that is flowing across land that is typically dry, and that water has to affect at least 2 properties. If you live in a rural area, like you see here, this is a farm in Minnesota that was affected by flooding, then that water has to be flowing over 2 or more acres of normally dry land. So what do we mean by 2 or more properties? Exactly what you see here in the picture. It could be the city, a city street, and then an individual homeowner. That is 2 properties. The only rule is that one of those properties has to be yours. So in this example, a water main burst. The water came up onto the street, flowed down the street and into the person's house. We would pay for that because water flowed across normally dry land and it affected 2 or more properties. On the other hand, if that water came up like into the basement through the ground, that's probably something we would not pay for. So remember, the condition of flooding must be general. It has to affect 2 or more properties and 2 or more acres, and flooding must be a temporary condition. There must be a definitive start and stop date of the flooding. flooding cannot be open-ended. We have to have a defined period during which that flooding occurred. So again, there must be inundation. That water has to flow across normally dry land. When we're talking about the overflow of inland or tidal waters, we're talking about a river or a lake overflowing its banks. The overflow of tidal waters, we see that in coastal areas. You'll see during hurricanes like storm surge, that kind of stuff. Rapid and unusual accumulation of water of any of runoff, it does not matter what the source of the water is. I gave earlier the example of the water main break, again, as long as it's flowing over normally dry land. This here is the picture from Midland, Michigan. Some people thought that flood insurance wouldn't cover it because there are questions about who's responsible for the dam failure. We don't care where the water came from. We just care that it flowed across normally dry land and it affected 2 or more properties or 2 or more acres. So if that happens, we're gonna pay it. It does not matter what the source of the water is. We also cover mud flow. Think of mud flow as very dirty water, like chocolate milk or Ovaltine. It's not a landslide. Those are 2 very different things. And of course, flooding must be accidental from the insured's perspective. If you flood your own house, we're not going to pay for it. So there are types of earth movement not covered by flood insurance. Remember, it is flood insurance. It's not earthquake insurance. It's not landslide insurance, and it's not erosion insurance. So we do not pay for earthquake, landslide, land subsidence, sinkholes, land destabilization, or gradual erosion. Now, the focus here is on gradual erosion. We do not pay for erosion that happens over an extended period of time. However, in this picture here, you'll see this is from the 2017 dam failures in Wisconsin. When during spring flood, so during snowmelt, there was a bunch of rain that also happened at the same time, which caused the dam here to break and for water to flow into the Wisconsin River. Because we have an event that meets the definition of flood, there's a defined flood period, and the erosion here was sudden, caused by this sudden release of water from the dam. We were able to pay for this loss. Paying for claims that involve erosion in flood insurance are highly complex. So if you have flood insurance and you think you have a loss that might be covered, go ahead and file that claim. It is not your responsibility to decide whether or not it is a type of erosion that may or may not be covered. It's not your responsibility to decide whether or not the definition of flood is met. That is the job of the insurer. Questions of erosion are highly complex. They usually require professional engineer involvement to make a determination. So if you're in that situation, my advice is to buy flood insurance, file a claim, let the insurance company make a decision on it. This is the claims process. It's pretty straightforward, just like any other insurance product. You have to tell your insurer that there was a loss. You have to have an adjuster come out and take a look. Sign your proof of loss. That sounds scary. It's simply a request for payment. It's telling your insurance company, hey, I've been damaged by flooding. This is how much I think my damages are, and I would like you to pay me. That's all it is. If you find out you have more damages, you can always send in another proof of loss. Signing that document doesn't mean you're done. It's really just the start of the claims process. You can always send in another one if you find out you have more damages. Again, if there's a federal disaster declaration, you should also register for disaster assistance. Remember that the standard flood insurance policy is not a valued policy. A valued policy is going to be an insurance policy that pays you the policy limits on your declarations page if you have a loss, regardless of how much that loss is. Flood insurance is a direct physical loss policy, so we pay for the direct physical damages caused by flooding as defined in the policy. It's also not a guaranteed replacement cost policy. There are times when you may get actual cash value, which is the cost to repair or replace minus depreciation, or a couple of other combinations of various loss settlement methods. So it's important you talk with your insurance agent about whether or not you have a replacement cost policy. There is a robust appeals process. If you file a claim and it's denied, We of course encourage you to continue to work with your insurer. You can always submit an additional proof of loss, like I had said, but if you can't reach resolution, you can appeal in writing to FEMA. You have 60 days after that initial denial to do that. Your appeal should be pretty specific about the items with which you disagree and provide additional supporting documentation. Finally, you have, if you still can't reach resolution, you have 1 year from that initial denial to seek litigation. And it's important to know here that state law does not apply. This is a federal program, so it would be in federal court, and federal common law and federal law would apply. We also have the Office of the Flood Insurance Advocate. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's a policyholder advocate. So if you've worked with your insurance company, you've worked with me and Katrina here in the region, or you've worked you've worked with Ceil in the state. If we can't fix your problem, these are the people that you would go to. They are the absolute last stop on like the problem solving pathway. You have to exhaust all of your other options first. So there's a website that you can visit if you want to know more about OFIA, but work with us here in the region and Ceil at DNR before doing that. It's gonna, in the 2 years I've been in this position, there's only been one person that we've had to send to OFIA because we couldn't fix the problem. And it was an incredibly unique one-off situation. So usually between Ceil, Katrina, and myself, we can fix the issue. That is my contact information. If people are happy to stay on, I'm happy to answer any questions that there may be as well.
Thank you so much, James. Again, we're running a few minutes over, but really appreciate you sticking with us. Madison is going to bring up a quick poll. Just want to kind of gauge where people are, and then we'll answer some of your questions. I see a few coming through in the chat, but please, if you have a question, now is the time to put that in the chat box. And our poll question is about what are your next steps? So what are you thinking about doing? Are you looking at maybe buying flood insurance if you don't already have it? Are you going to go look up your flood zone, learn more about your flood risk, or talk to an insurance agent, or you're just not sure? We'd love to know whether or not this webinar has helped. And Madison will tell us what the results are.
Thanks, Melanie. So votes are still coming in. So now's a good time to either cast your vote on the poll for your next steps you're considering, or type in a question that Melanie will relay to our panelists. So I'm going to give folks a couple more seconds to vote on our poll, and then I will reveal the results. Okay, so it looks like our group is going to learn more about their flood zone and their flood risk. So that's great. Those are great next steps. Some folks are still not sure. Someone's going to talk to their insurance agent. So I think that we have a nice result here. And remember, we'll hang on a few more minutes to answer some questions, and there will be a recording posted. So Melanie, take it away with the Q&A.
Absolutely. So the first question we have is from Keith, and I think this is aimed to James. Can you expand on the property move to safety coverage? And kind of a follow-up question to that is, can flood insurance proceeds be used to move a property to a higher location, or is it only applicable to repair in place?
Yeah, those are two very excellent questions. So property moved to safety would be, again, if you had, for example, advance notice of a flood event and you chose to move your items out of harm's way, we would pay up to $1,000 to do that. So I usually give the example of, let's say that there was, it was spring and there was, the typical snow melt kind of situation and the river was rising. And you took your personal property and you put it in a storage locker or a storage facility out of harm's way. We would pay up to $1,000 for you to do that. That does not, the deductible does not apply. So you would just, bring your receipts to the insurance agent or call your claims department, however your insurance company wants you to do that, and let them know what's going on and start the process of getting reimbursed for that through them. So again, it usually is a situation where it requires you to have advance notice, but let's say you have time to move your stuff even as the water's rising, you put in a claim for that, you know. When it comes to using proceeds for flood insurance, so that could be a complicated situation. And the reason I say that is because it depends, right? So if you have a flood insurance claim and we pay you for damages to your building, the intended use of those funds are for you to repair your structure. Whether or not you do that is kind of up to you. Maybe repairing your structure to you does mean elevating your building. That might be possible. But there are things to think about if you're looking at participating in some kind of a federal grant program, for example, to help with mitigation. There would be a duplications of benefits check, meaning that if you use that claim money for something other than its intended purpose, that could have an implication for your eligibility for grant funding. But more specifically, what would be a really excellent candidate for that is what was called increased cost of compliance. That is a bucket of money that is specifically intended for the situation that you're asking about. If you are damaged by flooding, and you are damaged to more than 50% of the value of your structure, your community should give you something called a substantial damage letter. When you get that, and you've already started the flood claim because you've already flooded, right? You again talk to your insurance carrier and you tell them that you've been substantially damaged, and they'll start the process of unlocking that extra $30,000. So if you're talking coverage A, building coverage, and using that claim money to elevate a building, that's kind of iffy, and you'll want to think really carefully about your options there. But if we're talking about coverage D, increased cost of compliance, elevating a building is the intended use. As long as that's the mitigation measure your community is going to sign off on, you are free to do that. Ceil might be able to speak more specifically about this, but I think across the state of Minnesota, it's a 50% threshold for substantial damage, or is there variation in that, and is it cumulative in Minnesota? I'm not sure.
The basic requirement's just the 50%, but most of the communities have a cumulative. And also a lot of them have the repetitive loss, so that if there's been 2 losses that average 25% in a 10-year period, you can also get that extra 30,000.
So I think it would be really important if you're in that situation to speak with your local building official to find out what the rules are in your community and see if increased cost of compliance is an option for you. I also want to let you know, I talked earlier about statutory limits. Increased $250,000 is the statutory limit. So let's say you have $250,000 in building damage. There's not an extra $30,000 available in that case because the statutory limit is $250,000. Let's say on the other hand, you had $220,000 in building damage. Well, of course, there's $30,000 left. You can still make use of that $30,000 ICC. Regardless of the circumstances, we can never exceed the statutory limit. So just bear that in mind. But anyway, sum it all up. If you're using your building coverage to elevate, I might think twice about that. If you're using ICC, as long as your local officials are on board and they're going to sign off on it, that's absolutely one of its intended purposes: floodproofing, relocation, elevation, or demolition.
Thank you so much. So we have another question. Would flood insurance cover erosion that's associated with seawall? I'm assuming this is damage to the seawall due to fall 2019 high water flooding on Park Point.
So, yeah, these erosion issues have been ongoing across all of the Great Lakes for a while now. And the best advice that I can give someone is that if you have damage that's tied to flooding, you should file a claim and work with your insurance company on that. These types of erosion issues are very complicated. They almost always require an engineer to look at that specific situation and determine the type of erosion that happened. I think it's okay to say that if you had erosion that's tied to a specific defined flood event, like that dam failure in Wisconsin we talked about, then you're probably good to go. But I think with some of the issues that are happening along Lake Superior, it's going to be quite a bit more difficult to be successful with a flood insurance claim for erosion in that case. I'm not saying not to file a claim, not saying not to have flood insurance, but I am letting you know that it's going to be a difficult hill to climb. But you should still, if you've got flood insurance, work with your insurance company on it and see once a professional evaluates your situation, if it is a type of erosion that we can cover or not.
I actually have a follow-up question on that. So for example, if you've got flood insurance and you're concerned about erosion being a future issue, should you be taking photos of your property so you have that before picture of what it looked like?
It wouldn't hurt, but remember that gradual erosion is specifically excluded. So if you're documenting erosion that's happening over several months or several years, then that's obviously gradual erosion and it's not something that's eligible under the standard flood insurance policy. What I would suggest for people who are having erosion concerns and they're looking for an insurance product that might be a good fit for them, definitely speak with your insurance agent. I don't know the specifics in Minnesota, but there could be a form of erosion insurance available. There's a product called Difference in Conditions, or DIC. That might be an option, but you'll need to talk to an insurance agent who's licensed in Minnesota who can speak to you about exactly what is covered in Minnesota in those cases. So gradual erosion, again, specifically excluded by the standard flood insurance policy. If it's happening over the course of months and years, it's probably not going to be eligible. I would definitely speak with someone about different insurance products that might be available and licensed in Minnesota that might work in the situation.
Okay, it looks like we have just one last question about wave action effects. So there's water flowing over the land, but it's intermittent. Is that considered flooding? And would you only have a claim if the structure is damaged?
Yeah, so flood insurance only covers the structure and the contents inside of the structure. So your structure would need to be damaged by water that's flowing over normally dry land that's affecting 2 or more properties and or 2 or more acres. So what you've described to me sounds a lot like that tidal overflow we were talking about, kind of comparing it to storm surge, for example. That would likely be something that we could cover. Again, you would need to file a claim and work with your insurance company on that. But to me, it sounds like an example of something that would be eligible, assuming that the structure is physically damaged by that water.
Thank you so much. So I think we're done on questions. Unless anyone else has any more questions, please put that in the chat box. First of all, I need to thank our speakers for joining us tonight, and thank all of you for attending, and a special thanks to Minnesota Sea Grant and Madison Rodman for hosting tonight. Just a reminder, Madison has been recording this. We will be posting that on the Minnesota Sea Grant page. And we've had a lot of really great links come through the chat. I have a list of all of those. I'll send that out as an email with that video link and some resources that James shared in advance. So thank you so much. And unless there's any more questions, I think we're ready to close up this webinar.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I'll see you when the map changes come out.